Routing matches a request URI to an action on a controller. So once we send an HTTP request, the MVC framework parses the URI and tries to map it to an action on a controller. In ASP.NET Core 6, the preferred way to set this up is through endpoint routing. If you're interested, there's a very in-depth article on that available on Microsoft's official documentation site, which you can find at the link on screen. But what you will learn here is sufficient for this course. To set up endpoint routing, two pieces of middleware must be injected in the request pipeline: the routing middleware and the endpoints middleware. app.useRouting marks the position in the middleware pipeline where a routing decision is made. In other words, where an endpoint is selected. useEndpoints marks the position in the middleware pipeline where the selected endpoint is executed. This allows us to inject middleware that runs in between selecting the endpoint and executing the selected endpoint. In other words, we can inject pieces of middleware that know which endpoint was selected and can potentially select a different one. These can see the selected endpoint, if any, and just use that, or they can select a different endpoint. A common example of this is the authorization middleware, as you can see on screen. It runs between the useRouting and useEndpoints middleware. We still need to map the endpoints though. There's two ways of setting these up: convention-based or attribute-based. For APIs, attribute-based routing should be used, so we will focus on that. Map controllers adds endpoints for our controller actions, but no routes are specified. In other words, there's no conventions applied. This, as said, is the preferred approach for the APIs. I do have to confess something now. The code you see on screen here is how you'd set this up in .NET 5. And you can still set it up like this in .NET 6. But there is a shortcut available. Instead of adding the routing middleware and endpoint middleware to the request pipeline manually, and then calling map controllers when setting up the endpoint middleware, you can omit adding the middleware to the request pipeline manually and call map controllers on the web application object directly on app. And that's because it implements endpoint routing. In fact, the web application object implements quite a few interfaces. Yet, I am not a big fan of this approach, because to me it feels like mixing in setting up your request pipeline via app.useX statements, where X is the middleware, with configuring your routes. That's the map controller statement. But anyway, it is an option, and if you prefer working like this, you can. But whether you do it like this or like I prefer, it still means that no routes are specified, so we have to set them up in another way through attribute-based routing. And that, as the name implies, allows you to use attributes at controller and action level. We provide these with a URI template, and through that template and the attribute itself, a request is matched to a specific action on a controller. For this, you can use a variety of attributes, depending on the HTTP method you want to match. You can see a list of that on screen now. For example, when consuming HTTP services to get data, we should send an HTTP request with HTTP method GET to a URI that routes to an action on a controller. And GET is just one HTTP method. There's more, all with matching attributes. We'll encounter each of these throughout the course, so you can regard this slide as a nice summary of what to use when. So if you're ever in doubt on which method you should use to, say, create a resource or update one, come back to this slide and you'll know. The last one on this list is a bit special because it doesn't match to an HTTP method, the route attribute. This is used at controller level. The provided template will prefix all templates of the action level attributes. That will come in very handy. For example, we see that all our sample URIs start with API/cities. The route attribute could be used at controller level with API/cities as its template value. Like that, we don't have to provide that value in the templates of all the action level attributes. So far for the theory. Now let's have a look at how we can use these with a demo. In this module, we will look into the route and HTTP GET attributes, and we'll encounter the other ones further on in the course.